Hello, and welcome to our presentation on the developmental sequence and neurodevelopmental movement. My name is Sandy Smith, and I am the Neurodevelopmental Specialist at Carolina's Biofeedback Clinic. Does your child seem like a puzzle sometimes? As parents, many times we think they might be, and as we try to put their unique puzzle together, we often wonder if we might be missing one or more of the pieces. Today we're going to look at how human beings grow and develop. We hear a lot about how important the first years of life are, but it is very helpful to stop for a minute and see just how much the first year of life impacts us for the rest of our lives. So, let's start at the beginning. This tiny baby has just been born. He cannot walk or talk or even eat a cheeseburger. He can only see black and white, but he'll soon be able to see the color red as well. He can move his arms and legs, but he is not mobile. He startles a lot, and his hands are usually in little fists curled up near his face. This little baby is a few weeks older. She still cannot walk or talk or eat a cheeseburger. Her favorite thing to do is to look at another human face. She sees mostly in outlines. She is mobile now, and she can crawl across the floor when placed there on her belly. She loves to hear the sound of your voice and will reciprocate facial expressions. Within a few months, human babies have made a lot of progress. This little baby still cannot walk or talk, but he can now creep on his hands and knees, and he can get to most anything that he is interested in. He can open and close his hands and use his fingers to pick up all the things that his mother didn't even realize were on the floor. Before long, our little baby has grown into a preschooler and no longer wants to be called a baby. Not only can she walk and talk, she can run, hop, skip, and climb. She loves to play with her toys, and she has quite an imagination. She can carry on a conversation with most anyone, and she attempts to tell jokes. In what feels like a flash, our preschooler is now a school-age child. He has lots of friends and gets along well with his teacher. He gets good grades. He likes math and wants to learn more about animals, especially Arctic animals. He reads well and enjoys school. He helps his parents by doing his chores, well, most of the time. And he is kind to his little sister. So here is the question. How do we get from here to here without too much of this? That is the question that we will answer in the next 30 minutes or so. My name is Sandy Smith, and I am a neurodevelopmental specialist at Carolina's Biofeedback Clinic. I specialize in neurodevelopmental movement, which is a specific approach to behavioral, social, emotional, academic, and psychological challenges. NDM, or neurodevelopmental movement, is based on the developmental sequence, which is represented on this lovely chart, which we will refer to the rest of our time together. We all know that children develop skills individually and that each human being is different. However, every human being's brain develops in a particular order, a sequence of development. This developmental sequence begins in utero and is extremely important to healthy brain growth. If there are gaps or delays in this all-important order of development, the result can be kids who have developmental delays, sensory integration issues, behavioral issues, attention and focus issues, impulsivity, and many, many more struggles. What we do with neurodevelopmental movement is to integrate or to reintegrate functions in the brain that may have never fully developed or that may have been lost due to an injury, a disease, or even trauma. Traumas that are as recent as a concussion in the last month or a disability that occurred in utero can be addressed through our in-depth work. So, let's dig in. The chart is organized by each row representing one stage of brain development, beginning at the bottom and working your way up. Each stage is the foundation for the next, and each one builds on the one before. Across the top of the chart, you will see columns representing areas of function. The three on the left-hand side are the inputs into the brain, how the brain receives information: the visual system, the auditory system, and the tactile system. The three columns on the right-hand side represent output from the brain, or how we are able to interact with the world around us. Mobility, how we can move; language, how we communicate; and hand function, how we are able to manipulate and interact with our world using our hands. Let's look briefly at each of the levels, and then we'll dig a little bit deeper. The lowest level is the medulla spinal cord level. This is the brain and the central nervous system that we have access to at birth. It is mostly made up of reflexes that are necessary for birth and for survival. The next level up is the pons level. The pons is our survival brain. It is the time when the amygdala comes on board. This time period is usually from about 1 month of age, or maybe 6 weeks, to 5 to 7 months approximately. Remember that the layers overlap, development overlaps, so you will see things from both layers being completed and worked on at the same time. Many reflexes that were in the medulla and cord level will integrate during the time of the pons level. The next level up is the midbrain. This part comes on board, or this part of brain development comes on board somewhere between 3 months and 14 months. It is the bridge between the pons, which is our survival brain, and the cortex, which is our thinking brain. Many of the common challenges that we are going to talk about today are due to gaps in this particular level of infant development. This stage is when the thalamus comes on board. The thalamus is a particular brain organ. Sometimes we refer to it as the gatekeeper of where information goes. So our thalamus is like the part of the brain that says, as input comes in, the thalamus says, this is important, pay attention to this. Or this is not important, you can ignore this. Or this is an emergency. And it sends that information down into the pons level, down to the amygdala, where our fight, flight, or freeze responses live. So the thalamus is an extremely important portion of the brain that is coming on board during this midbrain period. It is the piece of the brain that determines sometimes whether we spend a lot of time in fight, flight, or freeze. It is the part of the brain that determines whether we can attend to the things that are important, or whether we attend to everything, whether it's important or not. If the thalamus is inefficient, it may tell us that things that are very important are things that really aren't important, and vice versa. The next level up, and the rest of the levels, are our cortical levels. The cortex is our thinking brain. It is our rational brain. It is our reasoning brain. Usually the cortex begins to come on board somewhere around 12 months, and we will call it today our thinking brain, our cortex, the brain that we use to think, to rationalize, to be able to execute coping skills. So if any of you have worked with therapists who have given you or your child really good coping skills, please understand that those coping skills are used by, or are informed by, the cortex part of the brain. What we are looking at are the areas beneath the cortex where the automatic brain functions happen and where they were first developed. The cortex is our place of intentional learning. It's where we store information. It is where we learn information, and we put information in different places in our brain that we can retrieve later. It's the home of our coping skills and our strategies. The beauty of neurodevelopmental movement is that we are able to access the precortical levels to address gaps in the foundations of our brain development. So now, let's dig a little deeper. The first level of brain development is the medulla and cord. This is the brain that we are born with. We are born with a full brain and a full central nervous system, but we don't have access to all of it. If we did, when we would be born and immediately walk around the labor and delivery room asking for a slice of pizza. Instead, we have a very primitive, very survival level brain that is basically reflexes. It is the little baby brain has the ability to be born and to stay alive. So let's look at each of the columns and what is developing during this very short time period. The first is the visual. At this stage, the baby can really only focus to about 10 inches from its face. Interestingly, that is approximately the distance from your nursing mother's arm to her eyes. Now, our visual system is incredibly important for brain growth, development, and for our emotions. Lots and lots of things are tied to our visual system. So, young mothers, please, please, please put your cell phones away. Your baby, when your baby is feeding, needs to be looking into your eyes. There is an enormous amount of communication that goes on from pupil to pupil between mother and baby when they are looking into each other's eyes. And the best time for that is when being fed, because little babies get fed a lot. So that time is super duper important. So what we see now with some children is that their mothers spend a lot of time staring and scrolling at their phones instead of paying attention to their new babies. We see some deficits in children who's maybe had a mother with postpartum depression or a mother who was using drugs and doesn't have any real response when she looks at her baby. That can cause some troubles for the baby down the road. The auditory system, this is how information comes in through our auditory system. And at this stage, this little baby has quite a startle. Every loud noise will cause this baby to jerk and startle. That is a reflex to the fact that there are sounds coming into the ears. It isn't actually scaring the baby at this stage because the amygdala, the fight, flight, or freeze response, has not yet come on board. The tactile system is an interesting one for our little baby. Remember, this little baby's brain is mostly reflexes. So there's a couple that are very interesting that you may remember. The first one is a rooting reflex. Our newborn baby has a reflex to where if you touch the side of their cheek and stroke it, that little baby will turn their head and open their mouth. It is a survival reflex. It is to help the baby find food because as a mother would hold the baby up next to her breast and the breast would touch and stroke the side of the baby's cheek, it would cause the baby reflexively to turn his head and open his mouth so that he can find food. Another one that's very interesting is that there is a reflex on our backs that if you stroke beside the spine of a newborn baby, their hip will wiggle. And if you stroke this next to the spine on the other side of the back, their other hip will wiggle. This is a reflex that is designed specifically to help us be born. As the mother's contractions touch that part of the spine and engage that reflex and the hips wiggle, it helps the baby to wiggle their way down the birth canal to be born. Once you are born, you do not need that reflex anymore. And so through natural movements, that reflex gets integrated into whole body movements that are now voluntary. So after a few weeks, the rooting reflex will no longer work. You can't walk up to a 3-year-old for the most part and rub their cheek and have them turn and open their mouth. That is a reflex that integrates to where you now have control over it. As the baby grows, the baby gets control over those reflexes. The same thing with the spinal galant reflex. However, many of our children do not have the opportunity to move enough to work that reflex and to integrate that reflex into their daily movements or into their voluntary movements. What that looks like is that you may have an 8-year-old or 9-year-old or 22-year-old who, when they sit in a chair and the chair touches that spot on their back, it will cause their hip to wiggle. These are our kids who are super wiggly sitters, the ones who can't stay in their chairs. These are the kids who typically fall out of their chairs. These are kids who can't sit still. They're always wiggling in their chairs. Many times that is because they have retained that reflex. They have not done the movements that were necessary to integrate that into their whole body movement. We see that a lot with children who are defined as very wiggly children. They have a retained spinal galant reflex. So let's move on. That was our tactile system. Our mobility in the medulla and cord level baby is basically arm and leg movement, but they don't go anywhere. They don't have any mobility. They can't move from the spot that you put them on. Even if you put them on their belly, they're not really going to go anywhere. But they can move their arms and their legs. They can stretch. They can yawn. Their language system is basically a birth cry, a sweet little cry, a little tiny cry. A newborn baby, the cry that you hear in the delivery room is that little tiny, it's not a very loud cry. It turns into a loud cry in a very short period of time as our language system develops and moves from the medulla into the pons level. The hand function of a newborn baby is a grasp reflex. Some of you may remember your newborn babies. If you put your finger in their hand, they would grip it. They would grasp it without letting go. And sometimes it was fun as newborn babies, to put your fingers in their fists, and you could almost pick that little baby up because they have a reflex. They cannot let go. Your finger is in their hands. This will eventually integrate into the ability, when some pressure is put, to open up their hand. But in this medulla stage, it is a grasped hand. All right, so let's move on. The next level is our pons level. The pons is a specific area of the brain that develops during the period of time, somewhere around a month old, maybe 6 weeks old, to about 5 months or 7 months. It's when this section of the brain is coming on board. This is when our amygdala is developing. The amygdala is our emergency system. It is our fight, flight, or freeze response system, and it is developed during this time period. So this little baby, their brain is all about survival. Everything that this little baby does is based on staying alive. For example, this little baby's visual system is developing the nerves that control the muscles that cause the eyes to be able to track on the horizontal plane. That is what's developing during this time period. Why would that be important for survival? Because this little baby is looking for its caregiver. If this little baby is laying on the floor on its belly, it is searching. Where's my mommy? Where's my mommy? Where's my mommy? Or where's my food? Where's my food? Where's my food? Where's my food? Who's going to take care of me if something scary happens? That's what this little brain is all about. In the auditory system, our little baby is now still going to have a startle response, but it is not going to be to every noise. It is going to be to noises that this brain interprets as being a danger. Now, that doesn't mean it is a danger. It just means that this baby's brain interprets it as a danger. So it could be a dog barking, a door slamming. It could even be you sitting a book down on the table, causes this baby to startle, and then their language response will kick in and they will cry. And this cry is very different from the newborn baby cry. This is the cry that we refer to as the cry that no sane adult can ignore. This is that newborn baby cry that says, "Come get me, I'm about to die." It is a panicky cry. It is a cry that you cannot put off. If you've ever heard a Pons level baby crying, you know they don't take "wait a minute" very well at all. So the auditory system and the language system are very much related. The auditory is the input and the language is the output. Now, there's something we should note about this auditory response and the language. There is an incredibly important emotional component to these two pieces. Not just the auditory piece, but any time that this baby expresses their language in that baby cry, the cry that no one can ignore, should never be ignored. At this stage, this baby needs to be responded to. It is very important that this baby cries and that its caregiver, mother or father or caretaker, come and take care of that need, whatever it is that has caused that baby to use their language. That gives them confidence, for lack of a better word, in that they have a place in the world, that they can get their needs met, and it helps to balance the hormones in their system. So we have hormones, two ones that we will talk about today. One is cortisol. Cortisol is like brain poison. It is our stress hormone. And we have oxytocin, which is our love and cuddle hormone. And we really, really need our new babies to be responded to so that they are flooded with oxytocin, with love and cuddle hormone that says to them, oh, I'm okay. I'm safe in the world. My needs will be met. When I use my language, my needs will be met. Where we see big gaps in this area are with some of our children who are adopted from either social services situations or from foreign adoptions where they have been in foreign orphanages where there are very few caretakers and they really do not attend to the needs of these children. And so these babies are sometimes left in cribs and they cry and cry and no one responds to them. So they stop crying for help. They become very self-sufficient and very independent, but they are missing a big emotional piece, and that causes a lot of issues down the road for those children. The tactile system for this Pons level baby is all about survival, and it is about being able to feel the things that could be a danger to this child. So we look specifically at hot and cold, hunger and pain. Does your child feel hot and cold appropriately? In the extremes, this looks like a child who runs outside in 30-degree weather barefooted and doesn't even realize that it's cold. These children can be ones who would scald themselves in the bathtub without realizing that the water is too hot and is actually burning their skin. If you don't feel hot and cold appropriately, you don't know how to dress for the weather. It's more than a stubbornness. It's an actual inability to feel hot and cold. In the extremes, you see children who go outside in icy weather barefoot and don't even realize that they should have put on socks and shoes. They don't feel the cold. Or a child that would touch the side of a hot heat register and burn their leg and not realize. Or a child who gets hurt playing soccer. And there's a story of a child that was playing soccer and broke his leg and got up and kept playing because he didn't feel the pain appropriately for the degree of injury that he had. As it turned out, he had broken his leg when he fell about partway through the game. He finished playing the game before he went to the emergency room to get his leg taken care of. The other piece of this is pain. A child that does not feel pain appropriately can turn that unfeeling into aggressiveness or violence. Many of our children that are bullies have a very, very high pain threshold. So what does that mean? Well, if I can't feel pain appropriately, how am I to understand what it feels like when I hurt you? So in little children, we may see it as a child who hits another child with no remorse. Most little children, even little preschoolers, will have empathy and sympathy for their friends when they are hurt. They want to know, why is he crying? They feel because they know what it feels like when they have pain. A child that doesn't have a proper pain threshold may be a child that walks by and kicks another child just for doing it, just for nothing, for no real reason, and cannot understand, why is he crying? Why does that hurt? They just don't understand how pain feels. And so this is a very, very important piece, because if a child has too high of a pain threshold, they can turn that into violence as they get older. The mobility piece. For our Pons level baby, mobility is belly crawling. This is where we put our babies on their bellies, and they will eventually scoot across the floor with their belly on their floor and their arms and legs propelling them. It is very, very important that our babies be given time on their bellies from the earliest possible moment. Now, the earliest possible moment is when they can retain their own heat. Usually that's at about 5 pounds. So at about 2 weeks old, you should be putting your newborn baby on the floor on a smooth surface, barefoot, so that those little toes can dig in. Because what will eventually happen is this little baby who's just flailing his arms and legs will begin to use them to propel himself forward. Now in the Pons level baby, because everything is about survival, he's mostly trying to get away from danger. So if you hear a sound, that little baby's wiggling movements are going to be with the motivation of surviving, getting away from what scares him. Everything is scary to this baby. This is an emergency baby. But the movements that are done are really important for lots of other things. There are lots of connections that happen as the toes start to push and get a grip on the floor of this little baby. There are nerve endings that go from the toes all the way up to the brain, and the body is beginning to align. Belly crawling promotes good foot arches because of that use of the toes. It promotes grounding, and it is the beginning of the baby's body and brain learning that the bottom half of the body and the top half of the body work in coordination with each other. And that's super important emotionally as well. Lots of the phrases that we use, like stand your ground, feeling grounded, come from being able to use our lower body as a basis for what we do with our bodies. The beginnings of that are done during the Pons level part of brain development. So we want to make sure that our little babies have lots and lots of time on their tummies with the opportunity to be able to take those little toes and those little legs and those little hands and to be able to propel themselves forward. Now there's a progression of body movements that go with this crawling, this belly crawling. It starts out as homologous, like our arms will just move this way. And eventually we start to move in a little pattern where we use one side of our body and then the other side. And eventually it turns into a cross pattern where we'll use our right hand and left leg and our left arm and right leg to propel us forwards. One of the beautiful things that happens is that as that baby is crawling on its belly, it will reach out with its hand and come under its body and flip. And this motion, this supination pronation motion of our arms leads to fine motor skills down the road. So those of you who are really concerned with your child's handwriting or your child has really poor fine motor skills, if they did not spend enough time on their bellies, propelling and crawling themselves forward to have a good turning supination pronation of their arms, they may not have developed good fine motor skills. Now, the language area of this baby, we've already talked about a little bit. It is the vital cry that, the cry that no one can ignore. And we've already spoken a little bit about its importance. You cannot spoil a Pons level baby. These babies need to be attended to. When this baby cries, it needs someone to respond to its cry. It is extremely important for this baby's emotional growth and for its good, healthy ability to see the world as a safe place and to lower anxiety levels in the future. Our hand function for our Pons level baby is a vital release, which means that now if we put some pressure on that baby's little fist, so our medulla level baby is gripping your finger. If you put a little pressure on a Pons level baby, they will let go. And so being able to open their hand is a new skill that comes in the Pons level and in the hand function. This baby is going to soon be figuring out how to grasp things and pick them up using their hand. But the first step of that is to be able to open their hand. All right, let's move on to the midbrain. Now the midbrain area comes on board somewhere around anywhere from 3 months to 12, 13 months. This is not a specific organ in the brain, but it is the bridge that connects the Pons level brain to the cortex. So it's the bridge that connects our survival level brain and our thinking brain. It's incredibly important that we have a good bridge between the two so that we are not always living in our survival level brain, but that we have a nice bridge that goes to our brain that can think things through. This is the time when our thalamus comes on board. This is the gatekeeper that we talked about before. The thalamus tells us three things. All information comes in through the thalamus, and the thalamus tells your brain what to do with it. This is important. Pay attention to it. Hopefully right now your thalamus is telling you to pay attention to my voice and to what's going on the screen. The thalamus may also tell you this is not important, ignore it. So if you're sitting in your house right now and there's a car driving down the street, your thalamus hopefully is telling you, ignore that, that's not important right now. Now, the third option is that the thalamus takes in some information and says, this is an emergency, go into fight, flight, or freeze mode. So if you're sitting in your house and you're listening to me and your thalamus is telling you that my sound of my voice is important, but that the sound of the car going down the street outside is not important, so you can ignore that. But let's say that that car that's going down the street all of a sudden starts screeching and sounds like it's getting close to the front of your house, as if it's going to crash. Your thalamus is now going to not say that it's something to ignore. That car has now changed and has become an emergency. And the thalamus would send that information to your amygdala, which will start up your fight, flight, or freeze response, to where your body will automatically go into probably a run. The flight response would be my guess as the first thing you would do, because you want to get out of the way of a car that's going to crash through your house. So that's an example of what the thalamus does for us on a millisecond by millisecond basis. Now, let's take our child who is in elementary school, whose thalamus does not work efficiently. He's sitting in his third grade classroom. There's a light that's blinking above. Maybe one of the fluorescent lights is about to go out. So his teacher is working on math facts, but his brain is telling him that flickering light, how many times does that light flicker every 30 seconds? I could probably count that while I'm doing it. There are children going up and down the hallway from another classroom. Maybe they're waiting to use the bathroom or they're on their way to lunch. So there's sound of movement in the hallway. If his thalamus cannot tell him to ignore the sounds of the children in the hallway, to ignore the flicker of the light, to ignore the temperature in the room, because that's not really super important. It's probably neither too hot nor too cold in his classroom. He's not able to listen to math facts and to learn what his teacher is trying to teach him because he's attending to everything. Many of our children who are diagnosed with attention deficit disorder, ADD, ADHD, they're actually not inattentive. They are attending to everything. Their thalamus is not, their brain is not able to sort out the things that they should be paying attention to from the things that they should be ignoring. That is a midbrain level issue that we can address with neurodevelopmental movement. Many times our sensory issues live in this part of the brain. The feeling of tags in your clothes is something that your brain should be able to ignore. You feel them, you know they're there, and then you ignore them because they're not important to whatever is going on. But if your system can't filter out the things that should be ignored and cause you to attend to everything, then that becomes a problem. Now let's talk about the visual piece for our midbrain level baby. During this time period, the nerves that control the muscles that control vertical tracking are being developed. Vertical tracking helps your child, when they are in school, be able to line up a column of numbers in the correct order. It helps them to be able to read a line and then go to the next line, that's vertical tracking, to go down to the next line without having to use their finger. Some children, as they're reading, they get lost. They don't know what line they're on because they have very poor vertical tracking. One of the other things that comes on visually during this time period is the foundations of convergence. Convergence is, how do your two eyes work together? Are they looking at the same thing? Are they able to converge on the same item together at the same time? This is incredibly important. It has is not about acuity. This is not about where you can focus. It's about what actually your eyes are looking at when you are focused on one particular object. Many of the children we see, their eyes do not work together well. So what does that feel like? Well, if you are a child whose eyes are not converging correctly, when you try to read, you might see distortions, some of the classic dyslexic type symptoms where words move, or you might see sparkles on the page, or the letters look like they're falling off the side of the page. It can also cause you to not be able to see or perceive where objects are effectively. So it can give you a very disconcerting feeling, like if you go out in their tall buildings, they might look like they're leaning, or you might not be able to tell depth perception, how far away something is from you. So this can be very anxiety producing as well. So some of our very timid, anxious kids may really have very poor convergence, so that they are, they're very unsure. They're very uncertain because the information that's coming into their brains through their visual system is not reliable. And so we want to help them with that as much as possible. In the auditory system, we are learning at this stage that sounds have meaning. This is another very important place that we see gaps with these kids that we look at. The cadence of language. The auditory system interprets for you. Even if you were in a place where you were speaking a foreign language, let's say that you got helicoptered into some place that speaks Swahili, and you show up in a classroom and you do not speak Swahili, but you're in the classroom, and the teacher is giving instructions, and you hear in the tone of her voice, da-da, da-da, da-da. You may not know what she said, but you will know that there were 3 things that you need to do. And at that point, chances are you're going to look around to your friends to see what is it that I'm supposed to be doing. But you will know that there were 3 things, da-da, 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 just by the cadence of your voice or of the voice that you heard. That is an important skill, auditory-wise. It lends itself to being able to follow directions. I used to be a teacher, and in my classroom, many times there were children who would not pick up on the change in tonality when it was time for us to line up to go somewhere outside of the classroom. So I would always have one, sweet little child sitting on the floor with their little hands in their lap, waiting for the next thing to happen without realizing that the rest of the class was in line and ready to go outside to the playground or to go to the library or wherever we were going. They didn't hear the cadence of, okay, everyone, it's time to get in line. Or these are children that have trouble following directions because they don't hear the cadence that there's more than one thing. So they may follow your first direction or they may follow your last direction, but they miss the one in the middle, or they miss the first 2, or they miss the last 2. So this can have, a lot of implications for our school-age children and even for your lives at home with a child who doesn't hear the cadence in language. These are also kids who hear wrong tone of voice. So if you have a child who says to you a lot, "Why are you always yelling at me?" and you're not yelling at your child, but that's what they hear, that's what they interpret. They're having trouble. Their auditory system is not interpreting the meaning of the sounds correctly. It's doing it inefficiently, and it's causing them to interpret a perfectly calm but maybe firm conversation as yelling. Why are you always yelling at me? When you're actually not yelling. Or if your child comes home and says, "My teacher's always yelling at me," it may not be that the teacher is always yelling. It may be that they have a very immature auditory system. These children also have trouble interpreting jokes and sarcasm. This has a big piece in social skills, because if a child can't interpret the social skill of language, they tend to get themselves in trouble. So children who, for example, a little boy who doesn't have a good auditory system and is very socially awkward goes to school, and some child says to him, "Sure, yeah, I'm your best friend." if he doesn't understand, if his auditory system can't interpret that correctly, he may come home very excited. Mommy, Mommy, I have a new best friend. That little boy wasn't trying to be his best friend, but he didn't understand. And that gets them into a lot of social skills problems down the road, at school, in the neighborhood. So that is a big piece for a lot of these kids. Now, looking at the tactile piece, this is where a lot of our sensory issues live. And we kind of know that because we think tactile system is, the touch and how we interpret touch. But this is also something called our proprioceptive sense. This is knowing where your body is in space. So as a teacher, there were children who were always too close. They sat down and they didn't give the other children their needed space. And many times at school, we would use the words, stay in your bubble. This is your space. If you have more than one child at home, you might have one who's always sitting on the other one or sitting too close, or, he's touching me, he's touching me. These are kids who don't recognize where their body is in space and where their appropriate boundaries are. So physical boundaries are difficult for these children. This can also be an unsettling thing. If you don't know where your body is, many times you need to use your touch sense to tell you where your body is. So at school, a lot of times these children get in trouble for always having their hands on the wall. Now, some kids just do that, but many of our kids need to put a hand on the wall, or they'll walk down the hall rubbing their shoulder against it because they don't know where they are, and they need that physical touch in order to know where their body is. So we see a lot of kids that have poor body awareness, and that is a gap in this level and this area of their development. This is also a very good time to talk about in the tactile area. So we talk about a brain organ called the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum is a particular organ that connects the two hemispheres of the brain. So our brain is two hemispheres, and they are butted right up next to each other, but they are completely separate except for this connecting group of fibers called the corpus callosum. All information that has to go back and forth between the two hemispheres has to go through the corpus callosum. It is extremely important. If it is not working efficiently, then it is difficult for the brain to send and retrieve information back and forth between the two hemispheres of the brain. Now, what does that look like? So think of it this way, that you have a little brother brain and a big brother brain. And the little brother brain is impulsive. The little brother brain is excitable. The little brother brain is not calm. The big brother brain is much calmer and is kind of your rational thinking side. And so when little brother brain gets super excited or thinks of something impulsively, the big brother brain comes across the corpus callosum and says to the little brother brain, that's not a good idea. Don't do that right now. Little brother brain, I like to use the example of it's his birthday. You're in second grade and today's your birthday. And so you're at school and you are very, very excited because it's your birthday and there are presents at your house and there's going to be cake and there's going to be a party and there's all kinds of fun things going on. So little brother brain is excited and running around and jumping and doing all these crazy things and doing the happy birthday dance at school and whatnot. And if the big brother brain can't get across the corpus callosum to say to him, dude, you can do the happy birthday dance on the playground, but we're sitting in math class right now. Right now we need to pay attention to math. So it's related to the thalamus and the ability to know what's important and what's not important. But it has to do with communication between the two sides. And it's very, very important. The other thing that happens is that corpus callosum tends to have a harder time transferring information when your child is under stress, even if it's good stress. So children who are really poor test takers, who know the information, but cannot produce it on a test. It may be that the memory side, where they have stored all the information that they need to know, the part of their brain that needs to come and retrieve it can't get across the corpus callosum because under stress it breaks down and becomes more inefficient. And so what we work on is getting that corpus callosum built up to where it is working efficiently. This can be reading comprehension issues. The decoding of words is on one side of the brain, and the little picture that your brain makes of what you're reading is on the other side. So for good reading comprehension, it's important that information can go back and forth between the two hemispheres. So a child that has a corpus callosum that's not working efficiently has trouble. Many times they are good decoders and very poor comprehenders. All right, let's get back to the chart. Our midbrain level baby in mobility has now learned how to creep on his hands and knees. Now, this is super important for our bodies because at this stage, the baby is learning about gravity. The baby gets up, and you'll know, if you remember, you go through these little stages where the baby just like pushes up on his hands and his little hiney is sitting on his heels, and then he rocks up onto his knees and he may fall off to the side and he'll get back up. Babies are very resilient when it comes to not getting injured for these kinds of things. And so we give them lots of time on their bellies to push themselves up, to learn the balance of being on their hands and knees, and then to begin to move forward. The interesting thing is our midbrain level baby is no longer necessarily trying to move to get away from something. Our midbrain level baby is now curious and is moving in order to get to something. Now that's both good and bad, because as a young mother, you can remember, or I can remember, that once my babies learned to crawl or to creep on their hands and knees, now they could get to anything. They got to all the dirt that was on the floor, the fuzz balls, anything that was on the floor that I did not want them to put in their mouth is what they could now get to. The hand function at this stage is also getting to be where babies can pick up things using their fingers and get them into their mouths. So our little mobile baby is now creeping on his hands and knees. The other piece of this that's really important is that this is when good body alignment comes into play. So as that baby gets up on its hands and knees, it is developing alignment from the wrists to the elbows and the elbows to the shoulders, and also from the knees to the hips. So good hip alignment, good shoulder alignment. That baby is also learning how to use the upper and lower body together. And there's a lot of corpus callosum work that goes on when this baby is on its hands and knees and creeping across the floor, because you have to use both sides of the brain in order to do this movement. And that's where we build that corpus callosum. In the language area, our little midbrain baby is beginning to have meaningful communication. Now, what happens before the baby actually comes out with words is that the baby will babble. And the babbling of a baby is incredibly important. This babbling will take on the tonality of an adult. So if you think about it, if you remember little toddling around babies, if you've ever watched a group of toddlers, they love to pretend that they're on the phone. So they'll get something, anything, and they'll put it next to their ear. Hello, 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 blah, 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 and they'll make sounds, and the inflection of their voice will go up and down. They are learning meaningful communication by changing the tone of their voice. They do it through babbling before they actually get their words. And our last column over here is our manual and hand function. This is where this little baby is now not only able to open his hand, but he's able to start reaching out to grab things with his hands. And it will start as a whole hand movement, and then it will work its way down into that all-important pincer grasp. That pincer grasp becomes good handwriting. This is the motion, this is the connection that causes us to have the most efficient usage of tools. So this is why your child's preschool teachers and kindergarten teachers are always trying to get them to use their pincers to do things with, because this is incredibly important. That pincer grasp is used in lots of different things. It eventually develops into good pencil grip. We see a lot of children who have very, very awkward pencil grips. This is the most efficient use. It will be the least tiring on your child's hands as they grow and begin to write more and more and more. There is also a connection from your pointer finger directly to the language area of your brain. So this is important. As your baby grows, before they talk, they will begin to point to things, and they should use their pointer finger to do that pointing. That is their first method of communication with you. They're pointing. They want you to see something that they see. They don't have words to get your attention yet. So they might grunt and point with their pointer finger. If you have a child that points with their middle finger or their other fingers, then take note of that, because that is a red flag for some language issues. That first finger also being the one to direct the pencil for writing and for getting out our thoughts into writing sentences and stories is also important, because it is connected to the language part of the brain. Now, that's as far as we are going to go on the chart today, because most of the work of neurodevelopmental movement is done in those bottom 3 levels of brain development. We do some work in the cortex, but most of our work is in the first 3 levels. And so we could go through the entire chart, but that would take an incredibly long amount of time. So what does an NDM program look like? Typically, a neurodevelopmental movement program consists of 3 basic parts. There are other parts, but these are the main parts of every program. There is a movement piece, because the access to each level of the brain is through the movement piece. We do not learn to move as we are developing. We move in order to learn. Let me say that again. We do not learn to move. We move in order to learn. So each movement that babies make as they are developing creates brain connections in each of the functioning areas. The movement is a key piece. It is the access to that entire level of brain development. So if we have a child who has a gap in their Pons level, we will have them on their belly crawling across the floor in order to give us access to that part of the brain. The patterns is another piece of the program. Patterns are specific body movements where you'll move your head, your arms, and your legs in a specific way. Patterns are researched and are particular movements that send specific signals to the brain to address specific developmental gaps. It is a very important piece of our program. The third part of any NDM program is a sensory piece, and that includes vestibular movements, where we are stimulating the vestibular system, which is housed in the inner ear. These are short, fast movements that stimulate the fluid in the inner ear, which connects to our cerebellum, which is a key brain area for our visual motor skills, those all-important eye skills and convergence. It is an important key area for balance and for body awareness, that proprioceptive sense that we talked about, where you need to know where your body is in space. NDM programs are done at home with family support. The activities themselves are not difficult, but one of the key factors in success is consistency of doing the program every day. That part tends to be the biggest challenge for most families. So, what is the next step? You can set up a free phone consultation with me at Carolina's Biofeedback Clinic. You can simply go to our website at carolinasbiofeedback.com to schedule an appointment. You can also email me, sandy@cbfclinic.com, with any questions. The initial assessment consists of 2 appointments. They include the initial assessment and the program design. Then you, the client, or the child, the family, will go home and do the program from home. We will check in through phone calls or Zoom a couple of times over the next couple of months. And then we will reassess about every 2 to 2.5 to 3 months, where I will reassess and then tweak and change the program for the next couple of months. The average length of time that a child or a client is on the program is 2 years, some longer, some shorter, depending on the severity of your challenges and how consistent you are in following the program. Thank you so much for joining me today. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me by email, sandy@cbfclinic.com, or you can go directly to our website and schedule a phone consultation. Thank you again for joining me. I hope you have had many of your questions answered and that you found a piece or two of your child's unique puzzle today. Thank you.